The story does not begin with explosions, sirens, or troops moving under cover of night. It begins in rooms designed to feel calm. Offices with muted colors. Long tables. Screens filled with numbers instead of maps. Phones that ring without urgency. In these rooms, nothing looks like war. Yet this is where the strike begins. Far from Caracas, decisions are made quietly, wrapped in legal language and administrative procedure. There are no dramatic speeches at first. No declarations of conflict. Only adjustments. Small changes to rules. Slight shifts in access. A signature here. A compliance memo there. Individually, they look harmless. Together, they form pressure. And pressure, applied patiently, can be more destructive than force. Most people are taught to recognize power when it announces itself. They expect confrontation to be loud. They expect enemies to be named. They expect lines to be drawn clearly, with threats spoken into microphones and flags displayed behind podiums. That is how conflict is supposed to look. But the pressure on Venezuela followed a different script. It did not arrive as a single blow. It accumulated. It moved through systems most people never see and rarely understand. Banking channels tightened. Insurance became complicated. Payments slowed. Trade routes narrowed without ever fully closing. The economy did not stop. It stumbled. And that distinction mattered. Think about what it means for a country to keep producing, but lose the ability to move value. Oil can still be pumped from the ground. Refineries can still run. Workers can still show up. But if the oil cannot be sold freely, insured cheaply, or paid for reliably, the resource becomes a burden instead of a shield. Money does not disappear all at once. It pools in the wrong places. It gets stuck. It arrives late or not at all. Over time, this changes behavior. Decisions shrink. Options vanish. Survival replaces planning. From the outside, daily life appears unchanged at first. Streets remain crowded. Shops stay open. Flags still wave from government buildings. Leaders speak confidently about sovereignty and resistance. The language of defiance fills broadcasts and rallies. But beneath that surface, something essential is being drained. Not morale, not ideology, liquidity, access, the ability to convert effort into power. This is a quiet battlefield. And it rarely makes headlines because it does not shock the senses. It works slowly, invisibly, relentlessly. The common explanation is that Venezuela's crisis was self-inflicted, that it was a result of corruption, poor management, or ideological rigidity. Those factors mattered, but they are not the whole story. They explain weakness, not timing. They explain vulnerability, not precision. The escalation that followed was deliberate. It was calibrated. It relied on the fact that modern states do not survive on production alone. They survive on connection. Connection to trade, to finance, to settlement systems, to trust networks that decide whose transactions flow smoothly and whose are questioned, delayed, or denied. In earlier eras, empires collapsed when their armies were defeated or their capitals fell. Today, collapse can begin without a single soldier crossing a border. It can begin when risk calculations change, when insurers quietly decide that a route is too expensive, when banks decide that a payment requires extra scrutiny, when partners decide that dealing with a country is more trouble than it is worth. None of these decisions need to be coordinated publicly. They only need to point in the same direction. Imagine being inside a system like that. The state still exists. The government still functions. Laws are still passed. But every transaction becomes harder. Every import takes longer. Every export earns less. Officials spend their days solving problems that did not exist before, not because the country lost its resources, but because it lost its access. And access, once constrained, is difficult to restore. This is not the story of an invasion. It is not even the story of a single sanction. It is a story of leverage applied through infrastructure, through rules written far from the people they affect, through financial plumbing that determines what moves and what stalls. These mechanisms are rarely debated in public because they sound technical, boring even, but their effects are deeply human. They determine what shelves look like, how hospitals operate, whether factories keep their lights on. The pressure works best because it allows plausible deniability. There is no single moment you can point to and say, this is when the attack began. Each step can be justified on its own, as enforcement, as risk management, as regulatory compliance. The language is clean, neutral, professional, yet the cumulative effect is anything but neutral. It reshapes an entire economy's trajectory. Washington did not need to announce a strategy. It did not need to explain its intentions in detail. The systems themselves did the work. Global finance is not just a marketplace. It is a hierarchy. Some actors move freely. Others move conditionally. And some find that every door opens more slowly than it used to. Once a country slides down that hierarchy, climbing back up is costly, sometimes impossible. Inside Venezuela, the consequences arrived unevenly. At first, they were subtle. Delays, shortages that came and went, prices that fluctuated unpredictably. Over time, those disruptions became patterns. Planning horizons shortened. Importers demanded payment terms that favored them. Middlemen took larger cuts to compensate for risk. The economy absorbed the shock quietly, until it could not. What makes this kind of escalation so effective is that it does not trigger the usual responses. There is no enemy to rally against in the traditional sense, no invading force to repel, no battlefield victory to seek. Resistance becomes abstract, symbolic. The fight shifts from defending territory to managing scarcity, from projecting power to maintaining basic function. Think about how disorienting that is for a state built on the idea of sovereignty through resources. Oil had long been Venezuela's guarantee, its insurance policy, its proof of relevance. But oil only confers power if it can be monetized efficiently. When access to markets is constrained, abundance turns into fragility. The very resource meant to protect the state becomes a point of pressure. The brilliance of the strategy lies in its restraint. Nothing moves too fast. Nothing breaks dramatically at first. The system is allowed to strain, not snap. This keeps international attention diffused. It also shifts blame inward. As conditions worsen, the narrative hardens. Mismanagement is blamed. Ideology is blamed. Leadership is blamed. External pressure fades into the background, invisible but constant. This is the central tension of the story. A country is weakened not by destruction, but by exclusion. Not by force, but by friction. And because the mechanisms are legal, bureaucratic, and dispersed, they are difficult to challenge directly. There is no single lever to pull to reverse the process. Every fix requires cooperation from the same systems applying pressure. The stakes, then, are not just about one government or one crisis. They are about a model of power that operates beneath the surface of global politics. A model where control is exercised through standards, compliance, and access rather than occupation. Where dominance is maintained by deciding who gets to participate fully and who does not. The question that hangs over everything is deceptively simple. How do you cripple a state without firing a shot? The answer is uncomfortable. You do it by making normal life unsustainable while insisting that nothing abnormal is happening. You do it by letting the system speak for you. And you wait. This is how the pressure on Venezuela began. Quietly, patiently, in rooms that looked nothing like war. For a long time, Venezuela looked untouchable. Beneath its soil sat vast oil reserves, spoken with pride and certainty, as if nature itself had guaranteed the country's future. This resource was more than fuel. It was identity. It shaped politics, financed the state, and defined Venezuela's place in the world. Tankers waited offshore. Refineries hummed along the coast. Revenues flowed in waves, rising and falling with global prices, but always returning. To outside observers, this looked like strength. To many at home, it felt like security. Oil was not just wealth. It was sovereignty made tangible. That belief did not appear overnight. It was built over decades, reinforced every time oil income solved a problem quickly. When budgets tightened, oil filled the gap. When imports surged, oil paid the bill. When political promises needed funding, oil delivered. Other sectors slowly receded from importance. Agriculture declined. Manufacturing stagnated. Why invest in slow, difficult production when revenue arrived by pumping and shipping? The economy narrowed, but few worried. As long as oil moved, the system held. The state learned to govern through distribution rather than development. Money flowed in and loyalty flowed back out. Imports replaced domestic production because they were easier and often cheaper in the short term. Shelves filled with foreign goods. Cities expanded. Consumption became proof of success. The currency itself became an instrument of politics, managed and controlled to reinforce power rather than reflect productivity. On paper, this arrangement looked functional. In practice, it made the economy fragile. To the outside world, Venezuela appeared confident. It spoke the language of independence and resistance. It positioned itself as immune to pressure because it controlled something the world needed. Oil buyers might complain, but they kept buying. That reinforced the illusion. The country seemed too important to isolate, too resource-rich to corner. This confidence shaped behavior at every level. Planning assumed continuity. Risks were dismissed. Warnings were softened or ignored. But strength built on a single artery is deceptive. Oil revenue did not just support the economy. It replaced the need to reform it. Over time, that substitution mattered. Institutions weakened. Efficiency declined. Dependence deepened. The economy could absorb shocks as long as the oil artery stayed open. But it could not adapt quickly if that artery narrowed. Flexibility was sacrificed for certainty. And certainty, once shaken, turns into panic. Washington understood the structure well. It had seen similar patterns elsewhere. Economies built around one dominant export often appear powerful until access to markets is disrupted. The lesson was not new. What was new was the method. There was no need to shut production down. No need to seize assets directly. The goal was subtler. Make every transaction slightly harder. Introduce friction. Increase uncertainty. Let the market itself apply pressure. At first, nothing dramatic happened. There was no announcement that declared a new phase. No single policy that could be labeled the beginning of a squeeze. Instead, costs quietly rose. Insurance premiums increased. Shipping arrangements required more paperwork. Payments took longer to clear. Each change should be explained individually. Risk assessment, compliance, due diligence. Together, they altered behavior. Buyers hesitated, not because they did not want Venezuelan oil, but because dealing with it became complicated. Discounts were demanded to offset perceived risk. Intermediaries stepped in, taking a share to navigate obstacles. Revenue still arrived, but arrived thinner and slower. For a system accustomed to abundance, that shift was destabilizing. Inside the country, the illusion of strength lingered. Oil was still being pumped. Tankers still left port. Official statements emphasized resilience. But the underlying math had changed. Less money came in for the same effort. More resources were spent just to keep exports moving. The margin for error shrank. Small disruptions now had outsized effects. The state responded the way it had learned to respond. By tightening control, currency rules were adjusted. Import priorities were set politically rather than economically. These measures were meant to stabilize the situation, but they often deepened distortions. Businesses struggled to plan. Producers could not predict costs or returns. Confidence eroded quietly, then more visibly. From the outside, the system still looked whole. The machinery of the state continued to operate. Public rituals of power went on as before. But internally, the gears were grinding. Maintenance replaced innovation. Crisis management replaced strategy. The economy became reactive, always responding to the latest disruption rather than preparing for the next. This is where patience mattered. The pressure did not aim to cause immediate collapse. That would have drawn attention and sympathy. Instead, it aimed to exhaust, to let the system wear itself down under constant strain. Each month brought new challenges. Each fix created new problems. Over time, the cost of simply keeping things running grew heavier. Think about how an economy experiences this kind of stress. It does not fail all at once. It loses redundancy. Safety buffers disappear. Informal solutions replace formal ones. Networks become more important than rules. Those with access adapt. Those without fall behind. Inequality widens, not just in income, but in security. Oil, once the symbol of strength, became the source of vulnerability. Because so much depended on it, any disruption echoed throughout the system. Revenue shortfalls affected imports. Import shortages affected production. Production slowdowns affected employment. The chain reaction moved outward from the oil sector into every corner of daily life. The illusion persisted longer than expected because people wanted to believe in it. Leaders repeated it. Supporters defended it. Critics were dismissed. After all, the wells were still there. The oil had not vanished. But access is as real as possession, and access was slipping. What made the strategy effective was its ambiguity. There was no clear line between internal failure and external pressure. This blurred responsibility. It also complicated response. How do you rally a population against something they cannot see clearly? How do you negotiate against processes rather than opponents? The struggle became diffuse. By the time the illusion began to crack openly, options were limited. Reforms that might have worked earlier now carried higher costs. Trust, once lost, was difficult to regain. Partners who had quietly stepped back were reluctant to return. The system had adapted to exclusion in ways that reinforced it. This was not the collapse yet. It was a slow realization that strength had been overstated, that sovereignty built on a single resource had conditions attached. The country was still standing. The state still functioned. But the sense of inevitability was gone. Oil no longer felt like a shield. It felt like a weight. The machine still ran. But every movement produced more heat than progress. And the people operating it could feel that something fundamental had shifted, even if they could not yet name it. The turning point did not arrive with a single announcement or a dramatic speech. It arrived through accumulation. One restriction followed another, each small enough to defend on its own, each justified by procedure rather than politics. Over time, normal transactions became risky, then impractical, then impossible. What had once been routine required intermediaries. What had once been profitable required discounts. What had once been reliable required luck. The system did not break. It tightened. Oil still came out of the ground. That fact became a kind of psychological anchor. As long as production continued, many believed the crisis could be managed. But selling the oil was no longer straightforward. Buyers demanded deeper price cuts to compensate for delays and uncertainty. Payments were rerouted through complex paths. Insurance costs rose. Every barrel carried more friction than the last. Revenue shrank, not because a resource disappeared, but because access did. That distinction defined everything that followed. Money began to arrive late, or not at all. When it did arrive, it was often trapped by controls designed for a different era. Currency restrictions, once meant to stabilize the system, now lock value inside a shrinking loop. Importers could not access foreign currency when they needed it. Producers could not plan costs. Inflation surged, not as a sudden spike, but as a creeping force that rewrote daily life. Prices stopped meaning what they used to mean. Savings lost relevance. Trust eroded quietly. Think about the cause and effect. Less revenue meant fewer imports. Fewer imports meant shortages. Shortages changed behavior. People adapted by hoarding, substituting, improvising. Businesses adapted by downsizing, delaying, closing. The state adapted by asserting more control. Controls created new distortions. Distortions created new shortages. The spiral fed itself. No single decision caused it. The interaction did. Factories slowed, then went dark. Not all at once. One line stopped. Another followed months later. Spare parts became difficult to source. Maintenance was deferred. Skilled workers left or shifted to informal work. Production capacity eroded in pieces, each loss manageable on its own, devastating in total. This is how an economy thins, not through collapse, but through hollowing. From the outside, the story was simplified. Commentators pointed to ideology, to corruption, to governance failures. Those explanations were not wrong, but they were incomplete. They described internal weakness without explaining external pressure. They treated the crisis as isolated, when it was embedded in a global system that had quietly changed its posture. Friction does not look like force, but it produces forceful outcomes. Inside the country, the experience felt different. It felt like suffocation. Ships waited longer at ports. Cargo sat in warehouses, awaiting approvals that never came. Payments bounced between institutions, stalled by compliance checks. Vaults emptied faster than they could be replenished. The economy continued to function, but always under strain. Every transaction carried anxiety. Every plan included contingency after contingency. The loss of access transformed sovereignty into a symbol rather than a capability. The state still declared authority. It still passed laws. It still enforced rules. But its ability to shape outcomes diminished. Policy tools lost effectiveness in an environment defined by scarcity and uncertainty. Decisions that might have stabilized conditions in a closed system now produced unintended consequences in an open one constrained from the outside. Inflation accelerated the process. It was not just a monetary phenomenon. It was a signal that the system no longer trusted itself. Prices adjusted not to supply and demand, but to expectation and fear. People spent quickly because holding currency felt dangerous. Businesses raised prices preemptively because replacement costs were unknown. This behavior reinforced inflation, turning it into a feedback loop. Imports stalled. Medicines became harder to source. Industrial inputs became scarce. These were not luxury goods. They were the invisible supports of daily life. When they faltered, the effects cascaded. Hospitals improvised. Manufacturers substituted. Consumers adapted. But adaptation has limits. Improvisation buys time, not stability. The state responded with measures designed to assert control. Price regulations, distribution programs, enforcement actions. These interventions were meant to protect the population, but they also introduced new rigidities. Suppliers withdrew. Informal markets expanded. The gap between official reality and lived reality widened. Enforcement could not substitute for access. Control could not replace trust. Capital responded predictably. It avoided risk. Domestic capital sought safety. External capital stayed away. Investment slowed, then stopped. Without investment, recovery became hypothetical. The economy shifted from growth to survival mode. The objective was no longer expansion, but endurance. Every month became a test. What made the silent escalation so effective was its invisibility. There were no explosions to draw attention, no decisive moment to rally around. The pressure blended into the background of global finance, indistinguishable from routine operations to those not directly affected. To outsiders, it looked like normal market behavior. To those inside, it felt relentless. Think about how difficult it is to resist something you cannot point to clearly. There was no single policy to repeal, no single agreement to renegotiate. The constraints were dispersed across institutions, jurisdictions, and procedures. Each barrier was someone else's responsibility. Each delay was justified. The system became a maze with no clear exit. As conditions worsened, narratives hardened. Supporters emphasized resilience and defiance. Critics emphasized failure and blame. Both narratives simplified reality. Both obscured the mechanism at work. The truth sat uncomfortably between them. The economy was being squeezed by internal weakness, amplified by external restriction. Neither factor alone explains the outcome. Together, they do. The spiral accelerated as confidence collapsed. Once people stop believing that tomorrow will be better, behavior changes decisively. Long-term planning disappears. Short-term survival dominates. Skills erode. Institutions lose legitimacy. The cost of rebuilding rises with every passing month. This is not dramatic collapse. It is erosion. Internationally, the situation became normalized. What was once shocking became expected. Markets adjusted. Trade flows rerouted. The absence of Venezuela from certain spaces became routine. Normalization is powerful. It locks in outcomes by removing urgency. When crisis becomes background, response slows. Inside the country, the effects accumulated. Power outages, transportation breakdowns, workforce displacement. Each problem fed into the next. The economy lost coherence. Not entirely. Enough function remained to avoid total failure. But coherence is what allows systems to recover. Without it, recovery requires external relief or internal transformation. Both were difficult. The silent escalation did not need to be perfect. It only needed to be persistent. Time did the rest. Each delay compounded previous losses. Each workaround introduced new inefficiencies. The economy adapted to constraint in ways that made future constraint easier to impose. Dependencies shifted from markets to networks, from formal systems to informal ones. This adaptation kept people alive. It did not restore power. At no point did the pressure require consensus or spectacle. It required patience. It relied on the assumption that the system under strain would exhaust itself trying to cope. That assumption proved accurate. Resistance focused on rhetoric and symbolism, while the material conditions worsened. By this stage, the idea of returning to normal felt distant. Normal required access. Access required trust. Trust required change on multiple levels simultaneously. That is difficult under the best conditions. Under pressure, it becomes nearly impossible. The turning point, then, was not a date or an event. It was a moment when the economy stopped absorbing shock and started transmitting it. When every disruption rippled outward instead of being contained. When resilience gave way to fragility. When survival replaced strategy. The silent escalation had done its work, not by breaking the system outright, but by reshaping it into something smaller, thinner, and easier to contain. The strike had landed without ever announcing itself. The aftermath is not defined by a single image, but by accumulation. Crowded clinics with flickering lights. Idle refineries where machinery waits for parts that may never arrive. Long lines forming early in the morning, not in panic, but in habit. This is what financial isolation looks like after it settles in. Venezuela did not collapse in one dramatic moment. It adapted to scarcity, and adaptation slowly rewired daily life. People learned new routines, new expectations, new limits. The economy shrank, not just in size, but in ambition. Oil was still there. That fact continued to confuse outside observers. How could a country so rich in resources struggle so deeply? The answer is uncomfortable. Resources do not equal power. Access does. Oil without markets is inventory. Oil without insurance is risk. Oil without reliable payment systems is a liability. Venezuela did not fall because it ran out of wealth. It fell because wealth alone could not overcome exclusion from the systems that turn value into influence. Washington never needed to explain the escalation because it did not look like escalation. There was no declaration to defend, no operation to justify. Each restriction could be framed as routine, compliance, enforcement, market, discipline. Together, they produce a decisive outcome while avoiding the optics of confrontation. The language of rules replaced the language of force. And rules, once normalized, are difficult to challenge without appearing unreasonable. Inside the country, the state faced narrowing choices. Every option carried costs. Opening markets risked losing control. Tightening control risked further isolation. Appealing to partners required concessions. Resisting pressure required endurance. None of these paths led back to the world that had existed before. The economy had crossed a threshold. Recovery now required rebuilding trust, not just restarting production. The social impact spread unevenly. Those with access to foreign currency adapted faster. Those without relied on informal networks. Inequality deepened, not because of ideology, but because access became the most valuable asset. Skills that could move across borders gained value. Skills tied to stalled industries lost it. Migration became a release valve, draining pressure while hollowing out capacity. This was not policy. It was consequence. Internationally, the crisis faded into background noise. New conflicts emerged. New headlines crowded attention. Markets adjusted. Alternative suppliers filled gaps. The absence of Venezuela from certain flows became expected. This normalization locked in outcomes. Once a system adapts around exclusion, reintegration becomes disruptive. Disruption is something markets avoid. Think about what this means in a broader sense. In the modern world, power is exercised less through occupation and more through access. Access to markets, access to currency, access to settlement systems that move value across borders. Control those, and you shape outcomes without deploying troops. Deny them, and even resource-rich states can be brought to their knees. This model did not emerge overnight. It evolved as global finance became more interconnected and more regulated. Every connection became a checkpoint. Every checkpoint became leverage. Influence shifted from those who could seize territory to those who could shape rules. The battlefield moved from borders to balance sheets. Venezuela exposed the effectiveness of this approach. Quiet, incremental, hard to counter. It showed that sovereignty in the modern era is conditional. It depends not just on internal authority, but on external acceptance. A state can declare independence, but it cannot declare access. Access must be granted, maintained, and protected. The moral lesson is not simple. This is not a story of villains and victims. Internal decisions mattered. Governance failures mattered. Economic distortions mattered. But ignoring the role of financial isolation misses the point. Pressure does not have to be fair to be effective. It only has to be persistent. Imagine future conflicts shaped less by tanks and more by payment rails. Less by blockades and more by insurance exclusions. Less by invasions and more by compliance notices. These conflicts will be harder to recognize and harder to stop. They will unfold slowly beneath public awareness until outcomes appear inevitable. For Venezuela, the path forward remains uncertain. Recovery is possible, but it will be uneven and fragile. It will depend on restoring trust as much as restoring production. Trust from markets, trust from partners, trust from citizens who have learned to expect instability. That is a long process, longer than collapse, harder than resistance. The precedent, however, is already set. The most powerful strikes today do not announce themselves. They do not seek spectacle. They rearrange the rules and let time do the work. By the time consequences are visible, the leverage has already been spent. This story is not just about one country. It is about a shift in how power operates in the 21st century, about how economics has become a weapon and access the battlefield, about how silence can be more decisive than force. If this kind of hidden history matters to you, if understanding the forces shaping the modern world feels urgent, subscribe to the channel and share this documentary. The most important battles are often the ones we are not taught to see.